Lauren Boebert stood near the back of the House chamber during a procedural debate on voting rights legislation, her voice cutting through the general murmur of conversation, with a comment clearly intended to be overheard by the C-SPAN microphones and the reporters stationed in the gallery above. The Colorado Congresswoman had made a name for herself through provocative statements and personal attacks on Democratic colleagues, cultivating a brand built on controversy and confrontation that played well with her rural Western base and generated the social media engagement she relied on for fundraising and attention. Jasmine Crockett had just concluded her floor speech advocating for the voting rights bill under consideration, presenting detailed arguments about how the legislation would protect ballot access while maintaining election security, when Boebert made a mocking comment about Crockett's appearance, specifically targeting her fashion choices and professional presentation in a way clearly designed to demean and diminish her rather than engage with the substance of her policy arguments. The comment reflected a pattern of attacks that women in Congress, particularly women of color, faced regularly from colleagues who seemed unable or unwilling to debate ideas and instead resorted to personal ridicule intended to undermine credibility and distract from substantive discussions. What Boebert failed to anticipate as her comment echoed through the chamber was that Jasmine Crockett possessed not only the professional composure to handle such juvenile behavior, but also the quick wit and moral clarity to deliver a response so devastating in its precision and so aligned with the actual business before Congress that it would transform Boebert's attempted humiliation into a defining moment of accountability. Before we examine this extraordinary exchange where dignity defeats pettiness and substantive focus exposes the intellectual bankruptcy of personal attacks, make sure to subscribe and activate notifications so you never miss these crucial moments when members of Congress demonstrate that responding to unprofessional behavior with professional excellence remains the most powerful rebuke available to those committed to serious governance. The context for this confrontation extended beyond the immediate floor debate to encompass broader patterns in how political discourse had deteriorated in recent years, with personal attacks increasingly replacing substantive engagement, and with social media incentives rewarding outrage over thoughtfulness. Lauren Boebert had emerged as one of the most prominent practitioners of this style of politics, regularly making inflammatory statements about Democratic colleagues, filing articles of impeachment as publicity stunts, and using committee hearings as platforms for confrontation rather than oversight. Her approach had made her a favorite among the most partisan elements of the Republican base while alienating colleagues from both parties who viewed her behavior as beneath the dignity of the institution and counterproductive to the work of governing. Jasmine Crockett represented a starkly different approach to congressional service. She had built her reputation on substantive expertise, thorough preparation, and the ability to articulate complex policy positions in clear and compelling language. Her background as a civil rights attorney had taught her to focus relentlessly on facts and logic rather than allowing herself to be distracted by theatrical distractions or personal provocations. She had faced numerous attacks since entering Congress, including racist comments and threats that came with being a black woman who refused to moderate her progressive positions or apologize for her identity. Through all of this, she had maintained a focus on the work she had been elected to do, using her platform to advance voting rights, criminal justice reform, and economic justice, while refusing to be pulled into the kind of personal feuding that would diminish her effectiveness. The voting rights legislation under debate represented a critical test of whether Congress would act to protect ballot access in the face of state-level restrictions that had disproportionately impacted minority communities. The bill would establish national standards for early voting periods, restrict partisan gerrymandering, require states to obtain federal approval before implementing certain changes to voting procedures, and provide additional resources for election administration. Democrats argued that these provisions were necessary responses to a coordinated effort by Republican state legislatures to make voting more difficult for constituencies that tended to support Democratic candidates. Republicans opposed the legislation as federal overreach that violated principles of federalism and that would enable fraud by weakening security measures that states had properly implemented. Crockett's floor speech had addressed these competing arguments directly, presenting evidence that the state-level restrictions Republicans were defending had resulted in measurable reductions in turnout among minority voters while producing no corresponding benefits for election security. She had cited specific examples from her own district in Texas, where polling locations had been closed, voter registration had been made more difficult, and citizens who had voted without incident for decades suddenly faced new obstacles. She had explained how the federal legislation would address these problems while respecting legitimate state interests in administering elections. Her presentation had been professional, well documented, and focused entirely on the policy merits of the legislation under consideration. It was as Crockett returned to her seat after completing this speech that Boebert made her comment. The exact words varied slightly depending on which members overheard them, but the substance was consistent. Boebert had made a derogatory remark about Crockett's appearance, suggesting that she looked like she was dressed for a nightclub rather than the House floor, and questioning whether someone who presented herself that way should be taken seriously on policy matters. The comment was audible enough that several nearby members heard it clearly, and the microphones positioned throughout the chamber captured at least portions of it for the official record. The immediate reaction among members who heard the comment was mixed. Some Republican members appeared uncomfortable, recognizing that such personal attacks violated norms of professional conduct, even in an institution where such norms had significantly eroded. Democratic members were visibly angry, with several turning to stare at Boebert in disbelief that she would make such a blatantly inappropriate comment. Crockett herself had initially appeared not to have heard the remark clearly, but as colleagues informed her of what had been said, her expression shifted from confusion to a focused intensity that suggested she was deciding how to respond. The traditional options available to members in such situations were limited and generally unsatisfying. She could file a formal complaint alleging that Boebert's comment violated House rules regarding decorum, but such complaints rarely resulted in meaningful consequences and often generated more attention for the person being accused than for the victim. She could ignore the comment entirely, taking the high road and refusing to dignify the attack with a response, but this would allow Boebert's characterization to stand unchallenged and might embolden similar attacks in the future. She could respond in kind with personal attacks of her own, but this would reduce her to Boebert's level and undermine her own credibility as someone focused on substance over spectacle. Crockett chose a fourth option that would prove far more effective than any of these conventional responses. She rose and requested recognition from the presiding officer, noting that she wished to respond to comments that had been made regarding her remarks on the voting rights legislation. The presiding officer, recognizing the sensitivity of the situation, granted her request. What followed was a masterclass in how to respond to personal attacks while maintaining professional standards and advancing substantive arguments. Crockett began by noting that she had just delivered a speech presenting evidence about voting access disparities and explaining how federal legislation could address these documented problems. She observed that rather than engaging with the substance of her arguments, at least one member had chosen instead to make personal comments about her appearance. She stated that she found this response revealing, as it suggested that those who opposed voting rights protections had such weak substantive arguments that they needed to resort to personal attacks rather than policy debate. She then delivered the line that would define the entire exchange and would be replayed countless times across news coverage and social media. She stated that she had not come to Congress to participate in a fashion show or to win approval for her wardrobe choices from colleagues who apparently had nothing better to contribute to important policy debates. She noted that she dressed professionally and appropriately for the work of representing her constituents, and that she refused to accept that her appearance should be a subject of discussion when the chamber was considering legislation that would affect the constitutional rights of millions of Americans. She observed that the attempt to make her appearance an issue rather than addressing her arguments was itself evidence of the kind of discrimination that made voting rights protections necessary, as it reflected an assumption that women, particularly women of color, could be dismissed based on superficial characteristics rather than being taken seriously as policy experts. The response was devastating in its clarity and its connection to the actual business before the House. Crockett had not simply defended herself against a personal attack, but had used that attack as evidence for the broader argument she had been making about discrimination and the need for protective legislation. She had maintained her composure and her focus on substance while making clear that she would not tolerate attempts to diminish her through personal ridicule. She had elevated the discourse rather than descending into the petty confrontation that Boebert had apparently hoped to provoke. The reaction in the chamber was immediate and striking. Democratic members rose in sustained applause, not merely supporting a colleague who had been attacked, but celebrating a response that had demonstrated how to handle unprofessional behavior with professional excellence. Several Republican members appeared distinctly uncomfortable, apparently recognizing that Boebert's comment had been indefensible, and that Crockett's response had exposed the ugliness underlying such attacks. Boebert herself sat stony-faced, clearly not having anticipated that her attempted mockery would be turned into such a powerful moment for her target. The presiding officer allowed the applause to continue for several seconds before gaveling for order and moving to the next item of business. The formal proceedings continued, but the dynamics in the chamber had shifted. Members who spoke after Crockett on the voting rights legislation were notably more respectful in their disagreements, apparently having been reminded that policy debates should focus on policy rather than personal characteristics. The contrast between Boebert's pettiness and Crockett's substance had been made undeniable, and members from both parties appeared to recognize that the exchange had not reflected well on the institution or on those who engaged in such behavior. The media coverage of the incident overwhelmingly sided with Crockett, with commentators across the political spectrum praising her response and criticizing Boebert's initial comment. Major news outlets ran stories examining the broader pattern of personal attacks on women in Congress, and particularly on women of color, using this incident as a case study in the challenges these members faced and the resilience they demonstrated in continuing to do their work despite such hostility. Editorial boards called for stronger enforcement of decorum rules and for leaders of both parties to make clear that personal attacks would not be tolerated regardless of the political benefits they might generate for individual members. Social media reaction was similarly one-sided, with the hashtag Professional Excellence trending as users shared clips of Crockett's response and praised her for handling the situation with such grace and effectiveness. Even many conservative commentators who disagreed with her policy positions acknowledged that she had responded appropriately to an inappropriate attack, and that Boebert had embarrassed herself and her party through behavior that had no place in congressional proceedings. The contrast between how the two members conducted themselves became a topic of broader discussion about what kind of representation Americans should expect from their elected officials. Lauren Boebert attempted damage control by claiming that her comment had been misconstrued and that she had simply been making an observation rather than launching a personal attack. These explanations convinced virtually no one, as multiple members had heard the comment clearly and had understood its obviously derogatory intent. Her attempt to walk back the remark only drew additional attention to it and reinforced the perception that she recognized she had crossed a line but lacked the character to acknowledge her error directly. Republican leadership faced pressure to discipline Boebert, or at minimum to make clear that such behavior was unacceptable, though the responses from party leaders were notably muted and focused more on moving past the incident than on addressing the underlying conduct. For Jasmine Crockett, the incident became another example of how she had managed to turn attacks into opportunities to advance her substantive agenda. She had not sought the confrontation or welcomed the personal attack, but when it occurred, she had responded in a way that reinforced, rather than distracted from the policy arguments she had been making. Her ability to connect Boebert's attempt to diminish her based on appearance to the broader themes of discrimination that justified voting rights. Protections demonstrated sophisticated political communication that transcended simple comebacks or defensive responses. She had shown that maintaining dignity and focus on substance remained powerful even in an environment where such qualities were increasingly rare. The voting rights legislation that had been under debate when the incident occurred ultimately failed to advance due to Republican opposition, but the national conversation about voting access and discrimination had been meaningfully affected by how this confrontation had unfolded. Crockett's response had reminded viewers that the personal attacks women of color faced in politics were not separate from the policy debates about discrimination and rights, but were rather manifestations of the same underlying attitudes that made protective legislation necessary. The connection she had drawn between Boebert's behavior and the need for voting rights protections had given concrete meaning to abstract arguments about systemic bias in ways that statistical presentations alone could not achieve. The incident also had lasting implications for how personal attacks were perceived and deployed in congressional settings. Members who might have previously engaged in similar behavior became more cautious, recognizing that such attacks could backfire dramatically when directed at prepared and articulate targets. The deterrent effect was imperfect and incomplete, but the example of how thoroughly Crockett had turned Boebert's attack against her created at least some additional hesitation among those who viewed personal confrontation as a viable political strategy. The institutional culture of Congress had not been transformed by a single exchange, but the boundaries of acceptable behavior had been reinforced in ways that provided some protection for members who might otherwise have faced similar treatment. If this account of professional composure triumphing over personal pettiness resonated with you, subscribe now and enable notifications so you never miss these defining moments when substantive focus defeats superficial attacks and those who attempt to diminish others through ridicule find themselves exposed as lacking the capacity for serious policy engagement. Share this story with anyone who believes that political discourse should center on ideas rather than appearances, and that elected representatives should be evaluated based on their command of issues, rather than on their adherence to standards of presentation imposed by those seeking to exclude or marginalize. The ongoing work of creating political institutions where all members can participate fully, regardless of their race, gender, or background, requires not only formal rules against discrimination, but also the courage of individuals who refuse to be diminished by those who cannot or will not engage with them as equals. Supporting that work means recognizing and celebrating moments when dignity and substance prevail over pettiness and distraction, and demanding that our representatives focus their energy on the serious business of governance rather than on the theatrical provocations that generate attention but undermine the possibility of addressing the real challenges facing our communities and our nation.